This is Dennis Ramondi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel now, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. We discuss anything and everything under the umbrella of contemporary spirituality. I want to begin by thanking those out there that have helped to keep Phil and I on the air, Phil and me on the air by contributing. We're not a nonprofit, but if you go to our website, spiritmatterstalk.com, it lets you know how you can help us keep a free and open archive and keep the show going. Our guest today, Franz Metcalf. He is a graduate of the Theological Union. He also has a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He is an expert, or we certainly consider him an expert in Buddhism, in American Buddhism and contemporary Buddhism. And he's written 5 books, and his books have been translated into multiple languages. And it's an honor, a thrill for us to have him on the show today. Many questions about what's going on in contemporary Buddhism. Certainly something Phil knows a good deal about, something I'm learning about, and we have the expert on. So thank you so very much, Franz, for taking the time to come on with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate, you know, the nerdy scholar in me really appreciates you self-correcting your keeping Phil and I on the air to keeping Phil and me on the air.
Yeah, exactly.
He'd have heard from me if he hadn't.
Well, it's like, how can I possibly still make that mistake? But anyway,
Franz, good to see you. Welcome aboard. Let's begin, as we usually do, with filling in our listeners and viewers with your background, how you came to the study of Buddhism, your own spiritual path in relation to being both a scholar and a practitioner, although not in equal measure. And we'd love to hear, you know, a short version of how you came to the work you've done.
Sure. This is a really good question, not just, you know, to ask of a person on your show, but for me to hear, because I am still constantly wrestling with this question. You know, who am I and what hat am I wearing and so on. And I think it's good for me to have to answer it, because every time I do, I think it helps me understand myself maybe a little bit better. I always thought Buddhism was cool. I grew up in San Francisco, you know, which it's a very Pacific Rim city. There's definitely Buddhist influences that I experienced, you know, as a young child and then in high school and so on, and in college at Berkeley. So I thought Buddhism was cool, and then I was an actor in high school and college, and for a few years afterwards, until I just realized you have to be either really talented or really lucky or really good looking. You got to have at least 2 of those, and I didn't really, I don't know which ones I was most lacking in, but I just definitely decided I did not have 2 of those. But I had been interested in reading books on Buddhism and so on, so I traveled around Asia for a year, in 9 months, when I was 24 or 25, and I really began to try to, I kind of tried to identify as a Buddhist while I was there, and I realized I certainly wasn't an Asian Buddhist, so I thought when I came back to America, I thought I'm gonna go to grad school, because, you know, I want to learn about this and see what it really is my relationship with Buddhism. And I realized then, in all those years of graduate school, that I was fascinated by Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, but I wasn't really a joiner. So I kind of forced myself to join Zen Center of LA by doing a dissertation project that made me join and be a scholar practitioner, be a participant observant in terms of ethnographic terms, because it was a field project. But I guess I've always felt a little more comfortable in an academic environment than in a Buddhist institution. So I continue to practice Buddhism, meditation, and so on, and I weave various aspects of it into my self-understanding and so on, because I had this very broad education in Buddhism, Buddhist history, Buddhist practices, Buddhist cultures in graduate school. And then so I've woven that into my practice and also into the books I've written. I've always felt that sense that, who am I to write these books? They're books applying Buddhism to everyday life. Like, there are so many more advanced practitioners and teachers, but on the other hand, nobody else seemed to want to do it. And also, my background in all sorts of forms of Buddhism is kind of broad. Introduction to and study of different forms of Buddhism allowed me to bring different practices and ideas into the books to share with people in a way that a really advanced high-level teacher in one particular tradition couldn't have done. So I felt like, well, I have something to offer, as it turns out, after all. So I still wear all those different hats, and I still try to integrate those things into my ongoing life, even at my age.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you consider yourself a Buddhist? And also back it up. What makes one a Buddhist? Or if you have a student you've taught for many years on the university level, and if you have a student that said, I'm really fascinated with studying Buddhism, I'd like to become a Buddhist. For Christianity, okay, you get baptized. This is what you do. For other religions, there may or may not be a ceremony which makes you a member. How does it work with Buddhism, and is it different in Zen Buddhism than in other forms of Buddhism?
Well, of course, the details of kind of the ritual practice of becoming part of the community are different in the different traditions. But I would say, though, just generally, in Buddhism, it is very much like it is in Christianity or in Islam or in Judaism or in Hinduism. When you really want to identify as that religion, most people want to do so through a ritual that puts them into a community of practitioners. And that's why I would say some very legitimate and maybe very wise Buddhists would say that I'm not a Buddhist because I am not a member of a community in that way. Mm-hmm. And remember the three jewels of Buddhism, right, are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha, the person who brings us the tradition or the idea of awakening, the Dharma, the teachings of the tradition, their beliefs and so on, and then the Sangha, the community. So if you say you're a Buddhist like me, I say I'm a Buddhist, but I have the Buddha and the Dharma. But do I really have the Sangha? And if not, then am I a Buddhist? And if so, what is my Sangha? And that's something that I work on, I struggle with.
There's also, Franz, I don't know if this term is used when applied to Buddhism in America, but it is to Hinduism in America, so it probably is. The distinction between the inheritors and the adopters. And so here in America, we think of Buddhism, we think of the beats and Zen, and we think of the contemporary mindfulness teachers and the Vipassana teachers as American Buddhists. But there are a whole lot of Asian Americans who practice a Buddhism that's more like what is practiced in Asia. So as both a scholar and an observer, in real life, how do those distinctions play out, and how are you greeted in your capacity by each?
Yep, we lost Phil for a second there, but I think I got the gist of the question. Well, actually, you're putting your finger on a really continually hot button issue in Buddhist studies, I can tell you. This old idea of two Buddhisms, and then people talked about three Buddhisms, and it's an ongoing mess. I like this terminology. I'm intrigued by your terminology of what do you call inheritors and adopters. There is something very similar to that in Buddhism. About 70% of Buddhists in America are Asian American. So, and about 95% of the coverage of Buddhism in America is about that last 30%, the white people, or the overwhelmingly white. That's a problem. That's a real problem, and it's led to distortions. You know, there's still this idea of you know, whatever, traditional Buddhists or ethnic Buddhists, heritage Buddhists, convert Buddhists versus ethnic Buddhists. You know, like Pure Land Buddhism, particularly the Buddhist churches of America, have been in America for over 100 years. And back in the days, in the 30s and 40s, they really changed their whole liturgy and their sangha organization, so on, quite intentionally to make them resemble Protestant Christianity. Even some of the hymns that they sing are Buddhist words sung to the melodies of some classic old Christian hymns. So what is that? Is that exotic? Is that Buddhism? Is that what is that? That's a hybrid that could never have existed anywhere except this country. And that's cutting edge stuff. They created that 70, 80 years ago. And yet they still get labeled as ethnic Buddhist, or whatever that's supposed to mean, as if not everybody in the world was ethnic. We're all ethnic in our different ways. So lots of problems there. And in terms of scholars trying to understand it and us getting it wrong, and also of the difficulty of these different kinds of sanghas of interacting and cooperating and so on. I'm sure it's very much like in Hinduism, Phil, in America, like yoga studios versus ashrams. It's amazing.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that about how they adopted the songs. If you go to an SRF Sunday service, which is Hindu, it's from Yogananda, and I went to a number of them, and it was like going to a Lutheran service, and they sing that. It was bizarre. To me, it was bizarre, but I'm not saying it was a bad thing, but I really didn't. It didn't seem right to me. It seemed strange, and maybe that's my problem. But if people get something good out of it, why not? But I can understand the confusion that must come from it, and what a traditional Hindu from India would think if they went to a service like that.
Luckily, I imagine this is true in the Hindu context, but in the Buddhist context in America, at least in large cities, you know, if you want to come and see something traditional that's part of your birth heritage from whatever sect of Buddhism you practiced back in Asia, you can find it. You know, you can find it just 15 minutes away. If you want to go to something that's highly psychologized or highly Americanized or is a woke sangha or something like that, you can find that too. So the diversity of it is great. The lack of mutual understanding, and mostly that comes from the dominant, the minority practitioners, that is to say the smaller amount, the white people, who feel that there should be nevertheless dominant. That's a problem. That they have nothing to learn from these ethnic traditions of Buddhism. You know, they have all this cultural baggage and so on, you know, which is, to put it another way, 2,500 years of practice and wisdom. So maybe, you know, you could learn from that.
Yeah, let me follow up, Phil. Would you categorize some of this thinking as racist?
Oh, I would, absolutely. You cannot live in America without being racist. That's my view. You can be an active racist. That is, you think that a white culture and white people are better than other people. You can be a passive racist. I'm just colorblind. I don't want to see anything. Or you can be a kind of self-aware, recovering racist,
right,
where you're coming to terms with privilege and working against it. But even when you do that, you still feel it. I mean, I was part of this problem in a way. Like I'm celebrating attention now in Buddhist studies to, and in this conversation, to Asian American Buddhists. But what did I do my dissertation on? Zen Center of LA, which is like 95% white. So, you know, and I didn't even consider it back. I mean, this is 25 years ago, but I didn't even consider it. I mean, that Zen was cool. Now, why did I think Zen was cool? Probably because it echoed certain aspects of my own cultural identity, which is a highly educated, you know, liberal white identity. So I acted in a racist way, not in an evil way, just in a racist way. We can't help. We swim in it. the water, we swim.
Right.
In your defense,
Yes,
Public defender.
I appreciate it.
I mean, it was a legitimate inquiry. It's a phenomenon. The adoption of Buddhism and Hindu practices and yoga and everything by the West, as you know, I wrote books about it. So it's a legitimate thing to be interested in, especially if you're a scholar like you are doing a study. It's like, you know, what's going on here? Plus, there was a lot of interesting things happening at the Zen Center of LA at that time, as I recall. So, you know, you can call it racist, or you could call it a scholar pursuing something of interest, you know, on a scholarly basis.
It's a both end, for sure. And when I use the word racist, I'm not using it in that way, that narrow sense that a lot of people use it in. Like, racists are people who hate people who are not white. That's a useless way of using the term in my perspective. I just have to put it more positively, what I've really rejoiced in my career as a Buddhist studies scholar from, say, the mid 80s to now, over that, you know, 35 years, the attention has moved from a bunch of old white guys studying texts and arrogating to themselves the authority to interpret those texts, as opposed to, you know, the peasants who practice this stuff, to a bunch of young scholars looking at Buddhists and their life ways and learning from them. And that, of course, also turns attention from the authority of the old white guy, which, you know, I've become, look at me, to the authority of actual people practicing Buddhism. And they're the authorities on Buddhism. They know, they spend their lives doing it. So we can, as scholars, we can add to that, we can nuance that, we can connect that up with other practices, we can do comparative work, and all that stuff is fantastic. But I really have loved the attention turning toward real Buddhists doing real practice. And I'm glad to have been part of that.
Franz, in my work with the traditions that come from India, the effects of colonialism are immense. The countries from which Buddhism came here, Japan, Tibet, Burma, Thailand, the colonization was different, and in some cases didn't exist. So that aspect of it is one thing I wanted to ask about. The other is the fine line between something from one culture being adapted to a new culture, which all the teachers who came here from Asia did, whether they were Buddhist or Hindu or whatever. And what we've now called cultural appropriation in an inappropriate, you know, form of, you know, taking something from another culture. How do you make those distinctions, and you know, how difficult is it?
Oh, it's extremely difficult. In my personal view, and the way we make the distinctions is still evolving. So, I mean, take the example of Buddhism and psychology, or the psychologization of Buddhism, and that's my particular field. So, you know, Buddhism came into Western awareness roughly at the same time that psychology was forming. You know, that modern psychological theories were forming, and schools were forming, and so there was this easy mapping of Buddhism onto psychology. Sometimes that it turns out to be a reduction of Buddhism to a form of psychology. That's cultural appropriation, or that's one form of cultural appropriation. That's wrong. That's just a gross distortion of the tradition of Buddhism, which is not a psychology in a Western sense. So that's bad. On the other hand, to take Buddhist meditative practices and integrate them into psychotherapy, that might be really good. To do that in a way that effaces Buddhism, that could be really bad. So, like, for instance, I have difficulties with the overwhelming popularity of the MBSR, of mindfulness-based stress reduction, because it really does intentionally efface Buddhism, and makes a kind of claim to Buddhist teachings as if they were universal teachings that the Buddhism can be taken away from. That's pretty much the literal definition of cultural appropriation. So that I'm not so cool with. On the other hand, psychotherapists that bring, say, choiceless awareness into a psychotherapeutic session, which is a lot like Freud's evenly hovering attention, that could be really great. That could allow for breakthroughs in the patient's experience that they might not have had any other way. I think if you label it and respect it and don't try to say it's your own thing and don't reduce it to your own perspective, then you're using it in a way that's fantastic. So that part doesn't seem to bother me. How do you make some fine distinctions in the, I mean, I've kind of made ideal types there. They're easy to distinguish. The
Right.
middle ground can be a little murky.
I'm trying to get my head around this. You know, I would love your perspective on this. Say I would say somebody is a personality theorist in psychology, Jung, Freud, anybody, somebody contemporary, Carl Rogers, who's ever doing it at the time. How do they use, or how do they bring in Buddhism in a way that is inappropriate, and how do they bring it in a way that is appropriate? So I think I want to understand how they would do it inappropriately.
My favorite example of this is
Okay,
is my namesake, Franz Alexander, who was one of the early students of Freud. So he's coming from a really classic Freudian perspective. This is back in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at Buddhist practice, meditative practice, particularly the jhanas, which are not the insight practice, but the calming, the samadhi practice, right? Calming practice. And he said, this is a regression to the womb. And it's tied up with thanatos, the death instinct. And, you know, it's obviously reductive, and it's obviously regressive, and you should never practice it. That's how to do it wrong. Okay.
But wait, what if he actually believed that? It's up to me whether I accept that or not. But if that was what he believed it was, or moving away from Buddhism to looking at Christianity and different rituals that had different things that monastic orders do, then some people, a psychologist or whatever, might explain it in Freudian terms or whatever, that to me would be incredibly inappropriate and crazy, because I was practicing meditation when I was in a Freudian program, and basically everything I was learning, they were twisting around to something to me that was bizarre. But is it inappropriate for them to do that?
I guess you might, to be charitable to somebody like Franz Alexander or these teachers that you had, I guess you could say that in their capacity as psychoanalytic thinkers, it's okay for them to make these interpretations. Mm-hmm. In their capacity as experts on Buddhism or anything else for that matter, they're idiots. And they're protected by their own power.
I agree. I had those same thoughts at the time. So, yeah.
Which brings us to the popularization of mindfulness practices in a secular context, in a therapeutic context, much as transcendental meditation and yogic practices were medicalized and therapized and all that. What is the thinking in your thinking and in the American Buddhist community in general about that? And on the one hand, these practices being available to a great many people who wouldn't otherwise be exposed to them. On the other hand, the de-Buddhaizing of it all, and is anything lost? Is anything, do we lose something in the secularization?
Oh, yeah, you lose about 95% of Buddhism. But of course, someone like Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's the originator of the mindfulness-based stress reduction, would say that that's a good trade-off. I mean, that was the trade-off that he intended to make. In a very self-aware way, being a doctor, he wanted to be able to bring these practices into the medical establishment, which he could not do if they were considered to be religious. So he took the religion out of the practices. And that has led to literally millions, maybe tens, I think probably now tens of millions of Americans being able to live more easily with chronic pain, you know, to reduce their medications, to be happier people. Well, who am I to say that that's a bad thing? I'm not going to say that's bad. That's good on its face. So what do we lose? So we've gained something, right? But and what we've lost, though, what we're in danger of losing, though, is that aspect of the Buddhist tradition that emphasizes meditative traditions within a religious context. Maybe that the danger that I would worry would happen is all that kind of practice gets sucked out of institutional Buddhism, reinterpreted, appropriated into the medical establishment. What's left in Buddhism then is maybe a path without heart. You know, is just old institutions and cultural practices that are valuable, particularly, you know, in terms of preserving Asian American identity over generations. Those are great things. Mm-hmm. But if Buddhism is reduced to just that, that's a real problem. Okay. And that's not just a problem in America. I mean, in Japan, mm-hmm. Buddhism is kind of dying in Japan. Temples mm-hmm. are going bankrupt because they're not centers of spiritual practice. They're centers of cultural respect and veneration for, you know, previous generations and so on. But that's not enough to keep them alive. So I think that's a huge loss. Mm-hmm. And so if that happens in America, I'd be sad to see that. Mm-hmm.
But what would you say if a student, a person came to you and said, I have been practicing mindfulness meditation. I really like it and all. But as I practice it and I go deeper with it, I'm realizing more and more it's something that's been secularized. It's something that's been taken out of Buddhism and given to me as a technique. And I'm feeling a little lost, and I'd like to really understand it in the context of Buddhism. And do I go to the original text? Where do I go to get that fuller experience and understanding?
Well, what I would do if someone asked me that is I would say, oh, I have some great ideas for you. Let me email you back. And then I would quickly go and I would research, you know, where they are, what centers are near them. And I would get a sense of the different kind of Vipassana or Theravada centers that are near them, which ones are most likely to be able to be open to welcoming that person in and value their psychological roots, but introduce them to the fuller aspect of the tradition. And then I would also recommend, you know, online sources. There's so much out there. Buddhism is, I think, certainly the second best represented tradition on the internet, religious tradition on the internet after Christianity. And not just best in the sense of most widely represented, but I think most responsibly and accurately represented. I mean, wow. You know, I teach religious studies and I try to find sometimes sources on, news sources to send my students, you know, to inform them or things for them to read. And when you do that on Islam, oh my gosh, the junk that is out there on the internet on Islam is just horrifying. It's horrifying. Mostly written by Christians, sad to say. So it's dangerous to send them out there to students. I mean, I don't even want students to research Islam online. But Buddhism, I can let them go and do it, and they're going to find relatively good material, which pleases me.
Franz, I'm aware as an outsider that within the Buddhist community in America, the American Buddhist community especially, not the so much the Asian as far as I know, and in your field of Buddhist studies in academia, they're both not without controversy at the moment, especially around issues like racism, inclusion. We've had other guests talking about how white the American Buddhist sanghas are, and the absence of people of color and so forth. Can you, I know, it's a big, complex subject, but if you could give us a sense of what the internal debates are and where you think it's headed.
It is really complex. But yeah, I can say a few things. One thing that makes it complex is that the Buddhist institutions that came to America were headed by people of color, by Asians and then by Asian Americans. And so in a sense, there's an anti-racist component to Buddhist practice and Buddhist institutions in America. On the other hand, as we were discussing earlier, the publicity, and the studies and so on have grossly over-focused on sanghas that are overwhelmingly white. So Zen Center of LA is a good example, because Zen Center of LA has been, except for 1 year of its now almost 60-year history, has been led by people of color. But having said that, it's been overwhelmingly white. The practitioners have been 90% plus white. So there's this strange disjunction there. So, and then of course, Buddhism is trying to fit into a culture that has been traditionally, historically, highly controlled by kind of Protestant Christian mentality, Protestant Christian people, Protestant Christian values, and so on, and has tried to fit into it. So there's an inherent complexity, but that's all within the context of the very simple reality of racism in America, which privileges white culture and white people. So even in these all these different, and Buddhism in America is a collection of hundreds and hundreds of different lineages and centers and temples and meditation centers that are all most of them are quite independent of each other. But in practically all of them, there's been of the ones who are trying to attract converts, I should say, in other words, white people, there's been this tendency to try to privilege white students and groom white students to take over, and mostly male students as well. So there's a real unfortunate kind of narrowing of the traditions along those lines. And in the last, say, 10 years or so, there's been a real and widespread pushback against that, and it's really it's a really positive development. So you have people who are you have sanghas that are intentionally designed, it's organized around people of color, or sanghas that are organized around LGBTQ plus people, or who knows what, right? And those sanghas have started to grow their own teachers, and then some of those teachers are trying now to change the dynamics in the older, very white male-centered lineages as well. And some of those lineages are really open to that. They're like, wow, you guys are doing these other kind of practices. There's a real tendency for white male religious institutions to be very focused on the individual spiritual development of people, particularly white males. And there's a tendency in American sanghas that are led by Asian Americans, or are led by people who don't identify as white males, to be much more community focused, much more communal, much more sanghas, to go back to that word, that's community. And to suggest that maybe awakening is a process that's a social process, that's a societal process even. And wouldn't that change what it means to be a Buddhist and what practice means? Practice is not just sitting on your cushion because you have the time to do that for several hours a day and go on retreats. You know, it's expensive to go on retreats, not just for the money that you spend at the retreat, but all the lost earnings. You know, if you say you can only be a teacher in our tradition if you've done a total of 6 months of meditation retreats, well, then you got to have money, and you got to have money in America. It means you're probably white. So it's great to say, hey, no, you don't have to have that. You have to have been with the community for 6 months. You have to, you know, whatever it is. And that changes the whole dynamic of who's the teacher, what people look up to, what practice really is. Maybe practice is being out on the streets and marching. In last June, we had a Buddhists Against, you know, Racism march, you know, during the time of the George Floyd protests here in LA. And it was really cool. There were like hundreds of Buddhists out there marching. To me, that was it was intentionally a meditative march. So rather than, you know, say his name, George Floyd, which, you know, I did at other marches, we were like, you know, we were in like Kinhin walking down the street in silence, carrying our signs. It was beautiful. So
we can imagine that if we did some preparation, we could get somebody on who would argue against your position.
yeah, that'd be easy. I could give you some names.
That's always the case with anything.
I just wanted to establish that it's an ongoing debate. Franz, we don't have much more time. Dennis, did you have another question?
No, Franz, if you'd like to finish with a message to our
Wait, I want to do one. Franz, we have to do some book promotion for you.
I remember that book.
This is,
what would do.
What would Buddha do?
Being Buddha at Work is the latest book. We'll have all of that posted up.
But
and any other information.
I wanted to ask Franz one quick question, because I always loved the fact that the last of the 101 questions in the book Franz put in is, what would Buddha do to discover what would Buddha do? So my question is, what would Buddha do if he saw a book called What Would Buddha Do? Give us a quick answer, Franz.
Well, he'd sign it for you.
That's good.
I'm sorry, we're on Zoom. I can't do that. You know, when I look at that book, I wrote that book over 20 years ago.
Wow.
It's so old now that when I read parts of it, it's like reading advice from someone else who's so much wiser than I am. It's really a kind of lovely feeling. You know,
you were so much older then.
Yeah, younger than that, for sure. So I look forward to you telling me when you've found and done an interview with that person who's going to totally trash all the things I said. Okay. I really have got to watch that episode right away.
We'll do it. Thanks for being with us, Franz.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And to our listeners, before you move on, make sure to subscribe if you're listening on a podcast, to the podcast. If you're listening onto the YouTube channel, to click there to subscribe. And we have about 300 shows in our archives now that are available to everyone free of charge, and we want to keep it that way. So thanks so much, Franz.
Thank you. Next time.
Phil, that was Franz Metcalf, really brilliant guy, well-educated, very insightful, and I still have a lot of questions. It's a very interesting subject. When is one, when is one taken from another culture or another tradition inappropriately? And it's a really mixed bag, I mean, let me ask you a question. If somebody who is Korean, I actually know a Korean gentleman who sings Italian opera brilliantly. Is that inappropriate?
Exactly. I
You
mean,
know,
look, nobody complains when we borrow from one another technology or art forms, or
right.
foods. We all celebrate. I mean, every culture's done. This has probably been going on, ever since the guys in Cave 26 met the people in Cave 80. There's an exchange, and so. But when it comes to spiritual or religious things, people, it gets more.
It's a funny thing, cultural appropriation. I mean, I grew up and I used to love to go to the Jewish deli. You probably like to go to the Italian deli. Were we doing something wrong?
I hate it. I loved my Italian food.
I loved it all. I mean, but was there something inappropriate? Was I taking from another culture in a way that I shouldn't?
See, that's the thing. But when it comes to things that are held sacred, that really give deep meaning to life, as opposed to, I always talk about in the context of American Veda, what's appropriate that we took from India and transformed it. And I always have to point out that some of the teachers we most venerate, Yogananda, Maharishi, all these people, they adapted their own cultural.
I know from my own background in TM that I was told that there were people in India who felt you're letting these white guys or these people from the West, white or black or whatever, women to do a puja, to teach these ancient techniques. It should only be for monks. It should only be, so that's the sort of thing that makes one wonder. I don't know, and I could see that. I mean,
but no one cares if a white guy learns the sitar,
right?
Or enjoys mulligatawny soup.
Well, once again, the religion is the big divider.
Yeah,
it's the thing that makes people upset. That people take. I know that there are people within Hinduism that probably think that a lot of the meditation from Hindu tradition has been secularized, and that's wrong.
Yeah.
And from what we heard today from Franz, probably a lot of Buddhists feel that it's this mindfulness. It's totally secularized. What are they doing? So I can understand that. At the same time, Franz made a wonderful point. Is it wrong that there are tens of millions of people now that are probably enjoying their lives more because they're practicing this technique? Where do you draw the line, and who has the authority to draw that line?
Same thing
with the two of us.
Yoga. Yeah. One of the things I like to point out is it's inevitable. Cultures are always going to borrow something useful and then adapt it to their own ways. And some people will adapt it with respect.
Right.
And some people will trash it. And that's the way it is.
Well, I think part of it too is if you give respect to and homage to the tradition, that I got this, this isn't for me. You could have some psychologist come along. Remember Herbert Benson, Dr. Benson?
Of course.
He basically took TM and secularized it. And I think a lot of people felt that he didn't give homage to where it came from, and centering prayer, same sort of thing. So that upsets people. On the other hand, there were people that probably benefited from all of these things that that weren't paid homage to appropriately. So it's not an easy question to answer.
No, it's not. And Franz is a scholar. He's a scholar, and he's a scholar of these phenomena, and he knows how complex it is. And look, when I talk about this stuff in the Hindu or yoga context, I always say a lot of this is inevitable, and we have to be very careful in distinguishing what's inappropriate from what is a useful form of adapting teaching so they become more accessible to more people. But at the same time, people who care about the traditions need to be vigilant.
Right. And even the two of us have been critical of, say, yoga, maybe yoga journal or some types of yoga, and where it's just really like, hey, get your body ready for the beach. Here we come. Hey, wait a second. These postures, these yoga asanas were developed for you to become enlightened. So this, I could, people get outraged by that. We've been critical, or at least I have, of that sort of thing. On the other hand, if that's what people want to do, if that's where they want to start, that's fine too.
And I know American Buddhist teachers of mindfulness, just as I know yoga teachers and teachers of yoga-based meditation, that are treading the fine line between making it, the Sanskrit term is upaya. It's skillful means. So you teach to the level that the student can accept. So if somebody just wants to look better or reduce stress, you can't deprive them of teachings that will affect them. But you can at the same time let them know there's more to it. And that's what a lot
and that happens everywhere. I was just thinking, I was speaking to a friend of mine who is he's Jewish, he's very Orthodox. And when I was talking to him about the Kabbalistic tradition and how it's become popular, he really rolls his eyes. He goes, people are studying this out of the context of where it should be studied. This is an advanced study after you've done this, and this. But on the other hand, there are people that take these courses and feel like it's, changed their life.
Yeah, and if you're really Orthodox, then only certain people at certain times, at certain ages, could have access to those things. When do you democratize?
Right.
I mean, I wrote this Life of Yogananda. He did that. He democratized a tradition that in India was taught from one guru to one disciple. And he made it, he used technology to make things more available to more people. So did Maharishi, so did Vivekananda, so did Satchidananda and Muktananda. They all did the same thing. And in the Zen tradition, the Suzuki, they weren't related, but both guys named Suzuki, who brought, popularized Zen, and some of the others, they made their conscious choices to make the teachings accessible to more people.
I have one last question for you, Phil, and that is, you mentioned you could bring somebody on that would give give argument to what Franz said. What would they say, those folks?
Oh, they would. There's a lot of people I know this. Franz knows more, but I know there's people who there are people who would defend just teaching in the usual way, teaching individuals to awaken. That's their job. And all the other stuff about, access and pluralism and race and color and all the rest, they don't think of that as appropriate, necessary things to think about in the context of teaching Buddhism, which is about becoming awakened. And they would say, I can't pay attention to that stuff. It's what it is. I open my doors and whoever comes. And then they would say that. And I know in academia that there are people who defend what Franz was reacting against. They think, their job is to study the.
And by the way, I thought he gave a fair and balanced approach. And all right. Well, great one.
Okay.
So next time, man, please, I think it's over here. Subscribe. Please hit the subscribe button, whether you're listening to the podcast or actually watching us. And we're getting more and more subscribers, and it's more and more fun. And hey, keep listening and email us if you have any ideas.
Yes, and please, if you listen to one of our shows and you like it, please share it on social media.
Yes, that's great.
Spread the word. Tell your friends to subscribe, and if you can spare a contribution so we can continue to upgrade and all that, or if you have any great ideas for how
SpiritMattersTalk.com, go there and
okay.
Appreciate it. Till next time.
Next time.